This is Strat News Global. I'm Amitabh Revi. Our guest today is Benedict Rogers. Ben, great to see you in India. We've done a couple of online chats before, but welcome. I know it's a very hectic visit, but thanks so much for taking out time for us.
No, it's a great pleasure. It's great to be here in person, and thank you for having me.
Pleasure's all ours. Wanted to talk about your visit to Dharamsala and meeting the Dalai Lama. Of course, the book that you handed over to him already has a written interview with him that you had done earlier. But what can you share with us about the meeting with him?
Well, obviously it was an extremely special moment. Like many people, I had followed His Holiness for many years with great interest. He's been a great inspiration for me. I had done a little bit of work, had a little bit of contact in the past with Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and of course their friendship is well known, and I'd followed the videos that they had done together and the books that they'd written together. So suddenly being in front of him in person was an extraordinary moment. It was a brief encounter. It was an audience. There were other people also having audiences with him. But I had a few minutes with him. And when I presented the book to him, it was very striking how his face lit up when he saw the Tibetan flag on the cover. And I was able to thank him for the contribution he'd made to the book. And then he had no hesitation in taking a photograph together with the book. So it was really a wonderful moment.
Well, this is the book that we're talking about that Ben has written. And I like the tagline a lot, which is the book that Xi Jinping doesn't want you to read.
Yes.
Could you tell us a little bit more about this book? Because it's wide. It's talking about your personal experiences over 30 years in and around China, as well as each of the issues that the Chinese Communist Party is being extremely repressive or coercive about.
Well, when I first started thinking about doing a book on China, initially I was a little bit hesitant because I thought there were thousands of books already on China. What can I possibly add that is new or of value? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that among the many books on China, there were very few indeed, if any, that put together in one volume all of the diverse human rights challenges. So the crackdown on dissent, on civil society within China itself, but also what I would say is a genocide of the Uyghurs, the decades of atrocities in Tibet, the crackdown in Hong Kong, and then on top of all of that, the increasing threats to Taiwan. Also, the Chinese regime's complicity with two dictatorships on its borders, Myanmar and North Korea, and the threats that China now poses to the free world well beyond its borders. And so that's what I decided to do. I decided to weave in a lot of personal experiences. It's not a personal memoir, but I do draw a lot on my personal experiences to bring colour to the story, as it were. And I end the book with a chapter on what the international community should do about this growing challenge to us all.
So let's take the issues one by one. Since we're talking about the Dalai Lama and your visit here primarily was focused on that. Tibet. I remember either reading or seeing an interview of yours from late last year where you were possibly lamenting the lack of focus on Tibet, or the spotlight on Tibet had kind of fallen off the grid. What is the situation currently in Tibet according to what you know?
Well, the situation in Tibet, I think, is continued and indeed intensifying repression. Of course, Tibet is the place that has suffered probably longer than all the other elements in the book, because it's suffered repression ever since the invasion in 1950. And it was interesting, actually, the day I met the Dalai Lama was the 64th anniversary of his safe arrival in India after his escape from Tibet. But today we see Tibet as almost a laboratory for the surveillance state in China itself. So the rollout of surveillance technology, the use of boarding schools and the transfer of Tibetan children from their families to boarding schools where they're basically indoctrinated. And essentially the Chinese regime has, and it has had for a long time, a campaign of signification of Tibet, trying to turn Tibet culturally and linguistically into a Chinese state. The reason I think that it's important not to forget Tibet is there are a lot of lessons we can learn from Tibet. And of course it's right that the Uyghurs and Hong Kong and the other issues receive the attention they receive, and I'm involved in those issues. But I think we shouldn't forget Tibet.
When you're talking about Tibet, I mean, the Dalai Lama himself has said that he's going to live up to 113, I think. But the succession issue has been talked about a lot, has been debated a lot, especially because of this repression and control that China tries to impose on the Tibetan people. Order number 5, I think it was in 2007, which dealt with that. Some even suggesting that the Dalai Lama should give a little bit more than just guidance in the succession plan. What's your assessment of that issue?
I'm not in any doubt that the Tibetans, especially the Tibetans in exile, will find a way, according to their own practice, of identifying the Dalai Lama's successor. I'm also not in any doubt that the Chinese regime will try to impose their choice, which is ironic given that it's officially atheistic state, and yet they want to be in the business of the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama. They also want to be in the business of appointing Catholic bishops in China. But I think that the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan community will find a way to choose a successor, and we may have a situation where there are two, in inverted commas, Dalai Lamas. But I hope the international community will be clear that it's the Tibetans' choice that we recognize, and not Beijing's puppet choice.
Well, that's something that happened with the Panchen Lama when there are two of them. But again, it's completely fallen off the grid in the sense, does anybody know whether the original Panchen Lama is?
I asked about this when I was in Dharamsala, and the answer I got was nobody knows. Nobody even knows whether he's still alive. And one Tibetan said to me, if he's still alive, why don't the Chinese regime, produce him, show him to us, and let us know how he's doing. But all they do is from time to time make statements saying, he's okay, he's well, but nobody actually has any details either about his well-being or his whereabouts.
It's interesting what happened very recently when the Dalai Lama introduced the reincarnation of the Khalkha Jetsun Dampa Rinpoche of Mongolia. Explain the significance of him doing that in the larger picture of what we've been just talking about.
Well, I think it's a timely signal to the world that the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan Buddhists have a long-established system for choosing key figures in Tibetan Buddhism, and that those figures don't have to come from within Tibet, and the fact that he's come from Mongolia is a sign that the reincarnation of key figures in Tibetan Buddhism can come from outside the borders of modern day Tibet, and I think that's an important message for us.
Your sense that you've got either on this trip or in your other experiences of the Tibetan youth, the new generation, is there a problem with this patience? Do they feel that there needs to be something more done? Do you think they think that the fight back should be maybe even with arms? Is there that kind of a thought, a process?
I didn't encounter that particular thought, and actually what impresses me deeply about the Tibetan cause is just how both reasonable and non-violent and peaceful it is. And they would have every reason after all these decades of repression to be looking to more radical action, but I certainly didn't encounter that. There are, of course, differences between His Holiness the Dalai Lama's middle way approach, which at least in principle is a profoundly reasonable and moderate approach, and I deeply respect it. I have a lot of doubts as to whether under the current regime in Beijing it's actually workable, given what Beijing has done to Hong Kong and to Xinjiang. But I admire the Dalai Lama for adopting such a reasonable approach. I did find, among other Tibetans that I talked to, that they don't share that approach. They want independence, and I respect their opinion as well.
Again, looking at China and the larger picture of countries that border China, and Bhutan has been in the news a lot. In India, at least, the king visited here. Issues on the boundary, which concerns that have been expressed, possibly not officially, but in the Indian media, about whether there's any change in policy with Bhutan. But your assessment of how China deals with issues like this, these boundary questions on its border?
I think it's clear to me that China, particularly under Xi Jinping, is now an expansionist state, and whether it's through literally expanding their borders, as they've been trying to do on India's own borders, or whether it's through increasing their influence, infiltration, coercion in neighbouring countries and beyond neighbouring countries, it's clear that their agenda is to dominate. And we see that in these issues relating to Bhutan. We've seen it clearly over recent years in Nepal, and then across Southeast Asia. I think, as I talk about in my book, China now has extraordinary influence in Myanmar. It's really probably the regime that is keeping the military regime in Myanmar alive, economically, with arms, and diplomatically. And that's because of its own interests. The same in Cambodia and across Southeast Asia. So wherever it is, it's clear that China is an expansionist state.
You were talking about India's borders, and we are very familiar with what's happening. I mean, lives have been lost. I think the only clash in that terms with the Chinese is the Indians who've been facing them. Galwan is one issue which is still being dealt with, that is Ladakh. But we've also just come back from Arunachal Pradesh and traveled all the way to the LAC and saw a lot of stuff there, including the area where the latest skirmish happened in December last year in Yangtze. And it's ironic again, like when you're pointing about the issue about Tibet, here again, the holy waterfalls are considered extremely religious significance for the Tibetans and Buddhism. And the Chinese are trying to use that to bolster their claim on Arunachal Pradesh as what they call South Tibet.
Yes, I mean, I think it is very ironic. The Chinese regime will repress religion most of the time, but it will try to weaponize religion when it suits it. And I think the threats to India is something that not only India itself, but the rest of the world should take very seriously. Xi Jinping seems to be, and over the last few years, seems to have been picking fights with everybody. And I think the places really for the world to pay close attention to are the India border, of course Taiwan and the South China Sea. And if China is allowed to gain any ground in any of those areas, that will be a major concern for the international community.
Like you said, you wear many hats, and the Uyghur genocide and the situation in Turkestan. Can you bring us up to speed as to, we've seen all the stories and the reporting that has come out from a very difficult area, but what is the situation currently?
Well, the situation is that what the Chinese call Xinjiang, what the Uyghurs call East Turkestan, is essentially a giant prison camp. I mean, it's made up of hundreds of prison camps. It's believed that at least 1 million, but quite possibly 2 million Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities are held in those prison camps. There's widespread religious persecution. Mosques have been destroyed or closed. And there is a campaign of forced abortion, forced sterilization, widespread forced labor. Both the previous and the current US administrations have called this a genocide. Several parliaments around the world have done so too. And a couple of years ago, there was an independent tribunal held in London, chaired by one of the top barristers in the UK, who had been the prosecutor of Slobodan Milosevic. and they found that this is a genocide. So I think it is, and as well as being a genocide, it is also there's also a lot of evidence of Uyghur slave labor being used in the supply chains of major multinational brands.
Hong Kong is another area of deep love for you, and you were associated with that for a long time. But is Hong Kong completely lost to the CCP as of now? And what are the lessons for Taiwan that can be learned from Hong Kong?
I think in the short term, it is hard to see Hong Kong returning to what it was. Pretty much every pro-democracy politician and activist in Hong Kong is either in prison, in exile, or has been silenced and is keeping their heads down. The press has been totally destroyed. There's no press freedom now in Hong Kong. There's basically no freedom of assembly. Even freedom of religion is now coming under some pressure. So Hong Kong has gone from being one of Asia's most open and free cities to one of its police states. And that's epitomized by the fact that the current chief executive, who was Beijing's appointee, spent his entire working life in policing, either as a frontline police officer or as secretary for security. So Hong Kong is now a police state. I think I don't say it's totally lost, because one must always keep hope, but I think change will only come to Hong Kong when change comes to China. The lessons for Taiwan are clearly that, first of all, Beijing can't be trusted. It doesn't keep its promises. And secondly, that the model of one country, two systems, which Deng Xiaoping originally designed for Taiwan and applied to Hong Kong in the hope that Taiwan would then be inspired by it, clearly Taiwan is not going to be attracted to that model on the basis of the broken promises in Hong Kong.
IPAC, again, is something that you're closely associated with, and I think on this visit you are meeting or have met a couple of Indian politicians. One, I think, from Arunachal Pradesh, the area we've just come back from, a current MLA or a legislative assembly member, ex-MP he was in Delhi, and an ex-minister. India's involvement in IPAC, because I remember when originally IPAC came out and we did a chat with you, you had expressed the hope that countries like India would also join with a lot of exuberance and fervor for the cause.
Yes, I mean, IPAC is an extraordinary organization. It's the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China, and it brings together something like 30 countries around the world, more than 200 parliamentarians, always on a cross-party basis, so bringing together people who may not agree on many other things, but they agree on the challenge of China. And I think what's important about IPAC is that it shouldn't just be Western democracies. It should be the free world as a whole, democracies around the world that recognize the challenge of China. And that's why having the participation of countries in this region, Japan, Korea, other democracies, and most especially India, given both the size of India as a democracy and the really crucial situation that India has with China at the moment, is really important. And I hope I'm looking forward to meeting the Indian IPAC members on this visit, and I hope India's participation will grow further.
And Rogers, absolutely appreciate your time and sharing all your experiences and expertise with us on Strat News Global and, of course, our audience.
Thank you very much.